My name is Dr. Keith Cruz, and I serve as one of the co-directors for the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice. For those of you who are not familiar with the CTRJJ, we are a Category 2 Training and Technical Assistance Center affiliated with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The overall mission of the CTRJJ is to support a comprehensive framework for developing, adopting, implementing, and sustaining evidence-based trauma-informed services for youth in or who are at risk for juvenile justice system involvement. Another broad goal of the mission of the CTRJJ is not just to anchor our work with youth directly, but to also think about ways of supporting families. And very consistent with the theme for our webinar today is also supporting the professionals that work within the juvenile justice system as well. There will be opportunities for you at the end of the webinar to find a QR code that will provide a linkage point. And I'd like to just review a few other housekeeping things and reminders before we move to our content. Throughout the webinar today, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the toolbar to submit questions. Our presenter will address as many questions as time permits at the end of the presentation. This webinar today is being recorded, and all registrants will receive a follow-up email notification from the CTRJJ when the recording of this webinar is available on the CTRJJ YouTube channel. For those individuals attending today that would like to have access to a certificate of attendance, there will be a slide at the end of our webinar today that will provide a URL and also a way for you to connect and download a certificate of attendance for today's webinar. Please note in advance that CTRJJ is not able to provide continuing education credits for our webinars. However, for your professional development and records, if that certificate is helpful, there will be access instructions at the end of our webinar today. With that, I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Patricia Carrig. Dr. Carrig is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Utah and a faculty member of the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice. Her research focuses on understanding the developmental processes that link childhood trauma exposure to adolescent justice system involvement and also to their recovery and resilience. And through the CTRJJ, Patricia has contributed to efforts at developing and disseminating a number of evidence-based and trauma-informed practices, and in particular is the developer of the RTIP curriculum that you will be learning about today, which has as its central focus ways of protecting staff from the effects of exposure to secondary traumatic stress. And with that introduction, I will turn our presentation over to Dr. Carrig.
Thank you very much, Keith. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you today. This slide gives a bit of an overview of what we're going to be doing in this next hour. We're going to be talking about how we define secondary traumatic stress and ways that we can go beyond engaging in self-care to foster our own resilience. And then I'll introduce you to some of the tools in the Resilience for Trauma-Informed Professionals toolbox. And along the way, we will do a skill building exercise. But to start us off, I want to tell you a story about how I became inspired to do this work. This was several years ago when, as part of the CTRJJ, I was doing trainings with juvenile justice staff using a curriculum called Think Trauma. And in that very first edition of Think Trauma, it featured some very graphic case studies that could be disturbing to staff. And at the end of one of those trainings that I was doing with a group of probation officers down in Provo, Utah, One gentleman who'd been sitting quietly throughout raised his hand and said, "You've convinced me it's important for us to know whether the youth we're working with have experienced trauma, but I don't want to be the one to do this work." And I was taken aback and I asked him, "Tell me more what you're thinking." And he said, "Because if a youth told me that any of those terrible things had happened to them, I wouldn't know what to say." And I thought to myself, that makes perfect sense. You've been trained as a probation officer. Your training hasn't included specific training in how to respond in helpful ways when youth disclose trauma. And even more, your training hasn't included how to cope with the difficult thoughts and feelings that can arise when we learn about other people's traumas. So I thought to myself, something more was needed. And I set out on a journey of discovery to learn everything that I could about what do we know about how we're impacted when we hear about other people's traumas, and what is it that is helpful to us in the aftermath. And I encountered some really wonderful resources that I'm going to share with you today. But I also saw some gaps, and I'll talk to you about those today as well. So, who in the juvenile justice system is exposed to others' traumas? It turns out we all are. That includes facility staff, probation officers, defense and prosecuting attorneys, judges, court staff, forensic evaluators, mental health providers, and even researchers who study topics related to trauma and violence. The ways in which these different professions are impacted can vary, but in the listening sessions that I've been doing with members of each of these groups, I've heard some common themes that include reading trauma-filled case history, doing trauma screenings, hearing trauma disclosures, viewing graphic evidence, interacting with distressed youth and their family members, and listening to our colleagues talk about their cases. And in addition, with facility staff and those who go into facilities to do their work, in particular, I have heard that it's not just hearing stories about things that happened in the past, but sensory inputs that tell us in an immediate and visceral way that something bad has happened here. So, why should we be concerned about our exposure to others' traumas? Well, it turns out that they can have a real impact on us. As Tim Wires puts it so succinctly, you don't have to be shot to go through a shooting. And in fact, exposure to others' traumas is a potential source of trauma for us. It's interesting to note that this wasn't always recognized to be the case. The long-standing definition of trauma in the diagnostic manual that describes the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis is that it refers to exposure to actual or threatened death, injury, or sexual violence through directly experiencing it ourselves, witnessing it in person, or learning that it happened to someone we love. And that we can refer to as primary trauma exposure. But for the first time, when the definition was revised in DSM-5, it included repeated or extreme exposure to somebody else's traumatic experience. And the definition even goes on to specify, for example, officers who are repeatedly exposed to the details of child abuse in their line of work. So that we can refer to as secondary trauma exposure and the effects as secondary traumatic stress. So if this is true, then being able to recognize and respond effectively to secondary traumatic stress becomes a professional competency for those whose work involves exposure to other people's traumas. So, beyond just self care that we're supposed to do for ourselves when we go home at the end of the day, the tools for recognizing, preventing, and responding to secondary traumatic stress are things that we need in our professional toolkits. However, even though I'm talking about secondary traumatic stress in the context of a diagnosis, I want to be sure to say that having a reaction to other people's traumas is not a sign of pathology. It's only human. PTSD and secondary traumatic stress come into play when those reactions cause us significant distress and interfere with our ability to function. In fact, as Rachel Raymond says, expecting that we can be exposed to trauma-related information every day in our work lives without being affected is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to wade through water without getting wet. Now, before I go on, I want to talk about the different terms that get used in this literature. Sometimes they're used as though they're interchangeable, but I think each of these captures one facet of a multifaceted phenomenon. So the first term we hear a lot is burnout. And burnout refers to feelings of emotional exhaustion and ineffectiveness that can come about when we feel powerless and unappreciated in the work we do. Excuse me. And burnout is certainly something that can happen in the context of exposure to other people's traumas. But what's important to know about burnout is it's not specific to trauma. The person who flips burgers at Burger King can experience burnout if they feel powerless and unappreciated. Another term that is often used is compassion fatigue. And this gets at that sense of being emotionally spent by caring for others without being able to replenish our own reserves, that we've gone to the well once too often and the well is dry. But this is a bit of a problematic term, and I want to tell you more about why I say that. There is a wonderful animated film that Brené Brown created to illustrate the difference between empathy and sympathy. And in this film, the little fox is feeling sad and goes down into the well of despair. Other animals come by and offer sympathy. Hey, looks rough. Hope you feel better soon. But this empathetic bear goes down into the well and shares the fox's feelings. The fox appreciates that. The fox no longer feels so alone and feels understood. But if you look at this still, what you'll see is the dark clouds of despair over both their heads. And I found myself thinking, what's going to happen to this poor bear? So if empathy means sharing another person's feeling state, compassion is actually something different. Compassion refers to recognizing that another person is in despair or distress and wanting to help. So when we're exercising compassion, we're not getting down into the well of despair. We're throwing the other person a lifeline and helping them up. And when we're doing this in the context of a mutually supportive social ecology, we're not having to do it alone. Others have our back as well. So all that is to say that I think compassion fatigue is an incorrect label for this phenomenon, that it's actually empathy fatigue. Yet another term that's used is vicarious trauma, and this gets at the change in our own thoughts and feelings that can come about when we have engaged empathically with somebody who's experienced trauma. And one of the reasons why I think this is a really helpful concept to know about is it's connected to another one that is called moral injury. As Brett List and his colleagues define it, moral injury refers to perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress our own deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. Moral injury is something that was first identified in military personnel who were coming back from service, troubled by things that they had seen or things that they had been involved in. But since then, it's a concept that has been applied to a wide range of different experiences and populations, including in my lab, youth involved in the juvenile justice system. We find that youth have no difficulty understanding this concept and identifying things that they have done on their own initiative or under duress, things they failed to do, or things they've witnessed that violate their own ideas of what's right and wrong. What we have found to be the dimension that is most affecting youth is betrayal. When somebody they should have been able to turn to for trust and care and protection has done something that violates their moral code. Then last on the list is the term that I've been using, secondary traumatic stress. And in the formal sense, this refers to the presence of any of the symptoms of PTSD, which can include intrusive thoughts and images, efforts to avoid reminders of the other person's trauma, negative thoughts and mood, and feelings of being hyper alert and hyper vigilant. And because I think of secondary traumatic stress as being on the extreme end of a continuum and including elements of the other dimensions, it's the term that I use to be inclusive. The other reason why these terms are helpful to know about is there also can be the opposite. So as there can be so-called compassion, or better termed empathy fatigue, there can also be compassion satisfaction, the positive feelings that we get from being competent at our work, having positive relationships with our colleagues, and knowing that our work makes a meaningful difference. And just as there can be vicarious trauma, there can also be vicarious resilience, the uplift that we experience when we witness another person's recovery from trauma. We do know a bit from research about what the risk and protective factors are for secondary traumatic stress. Working in an isolative work environment is a risk, whereas connection with our colleagues is protective. The sheer volume of exposure to others' traumas increases the risk, whereas there are ways that we can seek support and debrief that are helpful, and we'll talk about those in a minute. Some research suggests that those with high levels of empathy are more vulnerable, but compassion satisfaction can be protective. A key one is our own shame about having STS reactions, that somehow we're not supposed to be affected by these traumas, whereas openness and acknowledgement are helpful. Some research suggests that coming into this work with our own histories of exposure to trauma can increase the risk, but that is not a given. That the extent to which people have resolved and integrated and made meaning of their experiences can uncouple that link. And then finally, this is not something we have research data on yet, but it's my belief and my hypothesis that the mere fact that people are coming into this work feeling unprepared and untrained, like that probation officer said, I wouldn't know what to say, I think increases our susceptibility to the negative effects of secondary trauma exposure. So my goal has been to help people to have the tools they need in their toolkits to feel prepared. So what does secondary traumatic stress look like? Well, it depends on who you ask. But one of the resources I found that I really appreciated is a book by Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky entitled Trauma Stewardship. And in this book, she argues that if we're going to work with others who've experienced trauma, we not only need to be good stewards or caretakers of their well-being, we need to be good stewards of our own well-being and protect our capacity to do this work and be helpful. One of the things I love about her book is her use of humor, which I think helps us to look at some difficult things in a way that softens the blow a bit. So she got permission to use some cartoons that are very evocative, and so I sought that permission as well. And let's see what secondary traumatic stress might look like. One form it can take is feelings of helplessness and low self-efficacy. And although I think this is a funny cartoon, I have a bone to pick with it, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. We also might feel like we're working as hard as we can, but we're not getting anywhere. We're never doing enough. We're just howling at the moon. That feeling of hypervigilance, of being always on, barking at everything. Loss of pleasure in life. A big one is cynicism, when people find that they no longer have the sense of meaning and purpose that brought them to this work in the first place. People may feel trapped by their own indispensability. We're the only ones that can put out this forest fire. And as I said, one of the things that I appreciate about the humor is it lets us look at some difficult experiences. And in her book, Vandernoot-Lipsky accompanies these cartoons with quotes from actual people who are experiencing these signs of STS. For example, here's an animal rescue worker who says, every animal I rescue is just a reminder to me of the ones that I have failed to help, and that feels like a personal failure. Here, a community organizer talks about just going to work and coming home and going round and round the dial, and that being all that there is to life. And here, a domestic violence advocate talks about not even being able to enjoy looking at a friend's wedding pictures without the intrusive thought coming into her mind of, I wonder when the domestic violence is going to start. And then here, an attorney for death row inmates says it's not just a feeling that I can never do enough. It's true. If I don't do it, it won't get done, and somebody could get hurt. So signs of secondary traumatic stress may be physical, including exhaustion, trouble sleeping, headaches, backaches, and stomach aches, even getting sick more often as our immune system is affected. They may be behavioral, increased substance use or other kinds of addictive behaviors, including workaholism, anger and irritability, isolating ourselves socially, and what Francoise Mathieu refers to as the silencing response, shutting other people down, letting them know in all sorts of ways, I'm full up to here and I can't take any more. The signs may also be psychological, emotional exhaustion, feeling ineffective, negative mood, loss of pleasure in life, a changed worldview when moral injury comes into bear, and any of the symptoms associated with PTSD. And here we also see some major individual differences. Some people will report increasing sensitivity to anything that is a reminder of what they're exposed to at work. They can no longer tolerate going to certain kinds of movies or reading certain kinds of books. Whereas others report an undersensitivity that they feel numbed by exposure to those kinds of stimuli. And then there are signs in the professional realm. That overburdened sense of responsibility and feeling of being always on, or the reverse, avoiding work, resenting the demands of the workday, difficulty making decisions, and overall difficulty separating our work and personal life. And though I'm talking about these as separate domains, of course, they tend to co-occur and interact with one another. So in these listening sessions I mentioned, I've talked with professionals who have various roles in the juvenile justice system about how do they encounter STS and how does it affect them and those they see around them. And what have detention and residential facility staff told me about their experiences with STS? What I have heard is some describe becoming sensitized, being unable to read the charges or warrants of the youth that they have worked with if they involve certain kinds of offenses. Whereas others have talked about being desensitized and that being a double-edged sword, that it feels self-protective to be tuned out, but it also feels like it comes with a cost, that it feels inhuman and isolating, like being a robot on autopilot. Oops, this is coming up in interesting ways. I'm just going to put everything on the screen. There we go. They've also talked about struggling to maintain a balance between caring too much and being tuned out. That some who care too much put themselves in jeopardy, such as bending the rules for youth. They've talked about how it's particularly tough for staff who have backgrounds that are similar to the youth they work with. And they've also emphasized it's not just their experiences of trauma, but all the grief and loss these youth have gone to. Some talked about the strain of caring, of making a connection with youth who they know are just throwing their lives away. Another said, you see it in our body language, withdrawing, disengaging, not being present, even if we are at work. Being irritable and impatient when there's non-compliance. Others talked about how the effects spill over into their personal lives, feeling unable to relate to anybody outside the job. I heard about stress eating, not sleeping, no longer engaging in sports or other positive activities, not being able to stop thinking about it after work, and in particular thinking this could happen to somebody in my life. What happened to this youth? Some talked about feeling stigma about acknowledging the challenges they were experiencing and about seeking support. A lot of them talked about this being the main reason for absenteeism and turnover. As one put it, this job is not for everyone. The other thing I heard, though, and I thought this was really cool because it was specific to the detention and post-residential facility staff I talked to. They also mentioned sources of compassion satisfaction. As one put it, I sleep better at night knowing I helped somebody today. Another said, realizing how I'm affected by my work has made me more compassionate toward my spouse's stress. So is this news? Does nobody else know about this? Well, when I went to the literature, and I know this is a lot of tiny print, but these slides are just to illustrate to you how many articles have been written about the effects on facility staff and other people in the justice system of exposure to the trauma of the youth they work with. So clearly, this is something that we know is a concern. And in fact, just recently, sorry, drink water. A court system in Australia was found liable for failing to protect staff from the harms of what they were calling vicarious trauma exposure. The court determined that, excuse me, an employer has a duty of care when exposure of an employee to trauma is an inherent part of the work they do. So clearly, this is something we need to be paying attention to. Well, when we go into the literature on how we can help people respond to secondary trauma exposure, the main thing that we find is references to self-care. You can see here a veritable sea of self-care. And there's some helpful things. There are some measures that have been developed to help us do a check-in on, are we engaging in good self-care habits, which include things like taking time off when it's granted, eating healthy food, getting exercise, maintaining our social connections. But what happens in the real world when busy and stressed people come home at the end of the day? Too often, the things that are most readily available to us are not the things that are going to be most helpful to us in the long run. But more than that, there's some reasons to think that self-care has significant limitations. There was one study that I found particularly striking that followed a group of trauma treatment providers. And what they found is those who participated in trainings that were focused on self-care didn't actually spend more time in self-care activities. And I guess that's not surprising. We don't always do the things that we know we're supposed to do. But what was more surprising is the amount of time spent in self-care was not associated with lower secondary traumatic stress. Well, why might that be the case? I think that a prime reason is that most suggested self-care activities are things that we can only do when we go home at the end of the day. So they're taking place long after secondary trauma exposure, and they're divorced from our workplace. I would argue that instead, we need strategies we can use in the moment, here and now, and also proactive strategies to protect us in anticipation of secondary traumatic stress exposure, as well as activities that are integrated with our workplace environments. So if we look for an alternative to self-care, what might that look like? Oh, sorry, one more slide on limits of self-care. Another limitation is that the self-care literature doesn't necessarily take into account individual differences that are related to our cultural backgrounds. which influence how we think about what's disrupted by trauma, our beliefs in our own individual agency versus destiny and fate. And importantly, culture influences the processes that we believe will be healing. So, not all self care strategies are going to be relevant to us and not necessarily to be regenerative. So, if we look for an alternative to self care, what might that be? And what I would propose is that we think about the concept of resilience. And what do I mean by that? When researchers first started studying resilience, they wrote about it as though there were some people who were just armor plated. They could walk through fire without getting burned and were just impervious to all adversity. But as we learned more about resilience, we found that that wasn't an accurate characterization, that people who are resilient are affected by the experiences they had. And that's just as well because wearing a suit of armor would be a hot and heavy and uncomfortable thing to do. I also think resilience isn't captured well by this idea of us wearing a psychological hazmat suit that insulates us from the pathogens around us. In fact, having emotions related to our experiences is not only human. Our emotions are a valuable tool because they tell us when something needs attending to. So, what is resilience? I think of it as successful adaptation in the face of challenges, whereas knowing that resilient people are affected by their experiences. It's also not an all or nothing phenomenon. We can be resilient in some ways, even if we're struggling in others. And it's not a personality characteristic or a matter of our own true grit. It's made up of strengths and protective factors in a number of domains. Those include the emotional domain, our capacity to be aware of our emotions and cope with them, a cognitive domain, our ability to retain a sense of purpose and connection to our values, and an interpersonal domain, our capacity to be generative, to have compassion for ourselves as well as others, and to maintain a sense of community. So, what enables us to be resilient when we encounter secondary traumatic stress? I would argue that just like exposure to primary trauma, exposure to secondary trauma dysregulates us physically, emotionally, cognitively, maybe even morally, and causes us to experience as if it's happening in the present something that happened in the past. So the strategies that will be protective are those that reestablish our balance, ground us in the present, dispel unhelpful interpretations, and reconnect us to our strengths. So, with that in mind, I developed this curriculum, Resilience for Trauma Informed Professionals. And there's an article I wrote that talks about the conceptual underpinnings. But what I thought would be more helpful to introduce you to it is to talk through how the tools in the RTIP toolkit come into play at each stage of our encounter with trauma. And I'll go into more detail in each of these, but briefly, are there ways we can prevent unnecessary exposures? What will prepare us to encounter exposures in the future? And then what I thought was most missing in the trainings that I went to, what can we do in the moment, in the here and now, when we're being exposed to secondary trauma, And then after exposure, what are the things that we can do to monitor our well-being and to recover? So I'm going to give you some examples that come from the workbook that accompanies the RTIP training. And the first is about prevention. And one way that we can think about prevention is a need to know basis. So if a youth comes into a facility and we want to engage in trauma-informed practices, what is it that we want to know? Do we want detailed information about what happened in their past? Or do we want to know in the here and now, is this youth having post-traumatic stress reactions? If it's the latter, then maybe we don't need details about what happened in the past. And one of the tools that we have developed to help staff to learn about this is the triggers and coping strategies or safety plan that has three parts. The first is it invites youth to share what are their triggers? What are the things that push their buttons? And this will be very different for different youth. For some, it will be feeling crowded and intruded upon, whereas for others, it will be feeling left alone and abandoned. The next part of the tool invites youth to tell us, how would we know if you had been triggered? And again, it'll be different for different youth. Some will become loud and curse. Others will become very, very quiet. And then the third part of the tool invites youth to talk about what would help. What would help you to get back in control? Again, be very different for different youth. Some will want you to interact with them, and others will want you to give them five and give them time on their own. This is a tool that has been used in a number of facilities, and one where youth could earn points to allow them to post some things outside their rooms. Youth asked if they could cut out the pictures that were relevant to them and post them on their little bulletin board as a way of communicating with staff. These are my triggers, and these are the things that are helpful to me. Another way in which we can protect ourselves and one another is to recognize that seeking support and debriefing after exposure to others' traumas can be very helpful, but we also need to be thoughtful about it because STS can be contagious and we can be passing it on. So we talk about ways in which we can get the support we need without necessarily sharing all the graphic details, and also being able to let one another know if, hey, that's too much information, I don't need to know that. So we talk about a strategy called limited impact debriefing, that the key is letting somebody else know that you have something difficult you want to share with them and waiting to see if this is a time and a place where they can receive that information. We also talk about the things that can keep us stuck in a trauma story, even when we've been able to debrief. And here we talk about the essential role of the appraisals, the interpretations we make. These can affect our emotions, our behavior, and how we relate to others. They can be helpful and contribute to resilience, or unhelpful and contribute to secondary traumatic stress. But importantly, they are open to change. So then, in the moment when we are experiencing a disclosure, what are the things that we can do? What are the tools we can have in our toolbox? And here I took a page from a book of that probation officer who said, my worst fear is I wouldn't know what to say. Well, what do we say? What are the things that are helpful when a youth discloses, and what might not be helpful to say or do? And then we talk about a worst case scenario. If a youth not only discloses, but begins having a full scale post-traumatic stress reaction in our presence, what is it that we can do? How can we be helpful? And in all of this, we're considering individual differences, that what works as a self-regulation strategy for one individual is not the same one that will work for another. And so we're looking to explore and discover what works for us. Then after trauma exposure, what do we need to help us to re-regulate? One of the most important things for us to do is a check-in to see, are we being affected? Do we need to pull some tools out of our toolbox? One strategy for doing this is this terrific measure, the Professional Quality of Life Scale. It is freely available online, just takes a few minutes and gives you an instant readout of your level of burnout, secondary traumatic stress, and compassion satisfaction. The one limitation I would say is that your signs of secondary traumatic stress may not be the same ones as this measure's developer. So an alternative is to create your own early warning system. And here I want to dig in deeper and do a skill building exercise with you. This tool is called a dosimeter, and that's named after the little badge that an X-ray tech wears that tells them have they received a dangerous dosage of X-rays. If we had an STS meter we could wear, that would be handy, but we don't. And so we need to create one. And what this measure asks you to do is to think first, what do you like when you're in your green zone? When you're calm, thinking clearly, and in a good place. And then what do you like when you're in your yellow zone, when you're just beginning to be affected by exposures to others' traumas? And then what do you like when you're in your red zone and STS has fully gotten the best of you? We also encourage folks to think about how the signs that they experience may be different when they're at work from the signs that they bring home. A lot of people talk about being consummate professionals, doing well at their jobs during the day, and then coming home. And then the strain begins to show. When I ask people who's the best source of information to complete their dosimeter, often people will say, me, I know myself best. But I'd encourage you to consider the possibility that there may be things other people see that you're not aware of. For example, I had a colleague who told me, I can always tell when your work is beginning to get to you. And I said, really, how? And she said, because you lose your sense of humor. And I wasn't aware of that. I just thought she wasn't being funny. So this dosimeter becomes part of a larger STS protection toolkit that everybody develops for themselves. That includes knowing their signs, having a regular time to check in, identifying the strategies that will help them in anticipation when they know they're entering a situation, when they're going to hear about trauma. What are the things that are effective for them in the moment? And then after exposure, what is restorative and rebalancing? And then how do we stay connected to our beliefs and values? And how do we nurture that compassion satisfaction? We also talk about all the things that get in the way, including self-care seeming selfish. Whereas, as Saknova puts it, we have an obligation to our clients, ourselves, our colleagues, and our loved ones not to be damaged by the work we do. Or as Robin Tenner puts it, STS hurts you and it hurts your family. The other thing that I want to mention is that if we're going to go beyond individual self-care, we need to attend to the ways in which STS is not just an individual responsibility. Sure, there are things that we can do to gain professional skills, to invest in our own resilience. But an important part of the picture are the things organizations need to be doing to promote resilience and wellness in staff. So here we're jumping back to that. What are the things in the background that create a social ecology of mutual awareness and support around STS? So I think of organizational strategies as involving ways of preventing any possible preventable exposures, ongoing monitoring of staff well-being, and then responding to staff who've been affected, including referrals for outside supports. Because as I said, I take exception to this cartoon, as funny as it is, in that seeking therapy is not an act of low self-efficacy, is actually an act of high self-efficacy. And as an example of that, I was approached by a group that was involved in a very challenging work. They were having to view a really awful graphic material for ongoing quality control. And so we developed worksheets that started with what the organization could be doing to protect and prepare staff who are going to engage in this work, as well as what were some guidelines for the individual staff. So on these next slides, I've shared some resources, including organizational strategies and a really nice framework for STS-informed supervision of others. As well as some of my favorite resources on resilience and recovery from STS. And there's some resources that are specific to justice-related organizations. So on that note, let me pause, and I'd be very interested in hearing your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Patricia. And I've been some people have been issuing their greetings in the chats as well. And I kind of wanted to reflect on one person's comment, and then there's another question too. Is the comment from a viewer that they've been working in, looks most likely a Department of Juvenile Justice for over 20 years, and that this is now the first time that maybe the organization itself is starting to pay attention to this. And maybe it'd just be helpful for you to comment if you think that this is a trend, and how widespread organizations or an entire juvenile justice systems have not been, on top of, thinking about secondary traumatic stress.
Well, I second that comment. It's certainly been my observation. I think we've made a lot of headway with people appreciating that we need to do juvenile justice in a trauma-informed manner. But when that movement first kicked off and really gained traction many years ago, I felt like I was a voice, crying out in the darkness. What about the staff who are going to be doing this work? In particular, because the first way in which trauma-informed practices got translated was let's do trauma screenings. And that meant staff being exposed to information that is potentially related to STS. So I think that it's a shame that it has taken so long for this to gain the attention that it has, but I think that it is more and more recognized. And I think organizations are beginning to see that not responding to STS is costing them. because staff are voting with their feet and opting to leave professions in which they're experiencing this kind of thing without support.
Yeah, Patricia, I think that's really, in other organizations and other spaces where, I've been doing some work, many facility leaders, detention, post-disposition facilities, residential facilities have been talking post-COVID around the staffing crisis. So I think that
Mhm.
that point is very well taken of voting with their feet. This job is too much. It can be too hard. And, I think you and I might both recognize is that organizational commitments to taking care of staff, through some of the prevention, monitoring, and post-exposure skills that you're talking about here are really critical for organizations.
Absolutely.
Yeah, is a real specific question, Patricia, came up is in the Q&A is, are you familiar with EMDR and the acronym GTEP and the use of it as a guided self-help tool for processing traumatic events as a group? And if so, are you aware of this? And if so, and maybe any experience or any thoughts around that?
Oh, that sounds fascinating. I am familiar with EMDR, but not with this group processing technique. That sounds really interesting. I think that one of the things that has been a lesson learned for the field, though, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily what this process would involve, is that we need to be careful with requiring people to participate in various kinds of group processes. Initially, it was thought that in the aftermath of crisis, people needed to debrief. And there were models of group debriefing that turned out to have negative effects. That in fact, people were being exposed to other people's distress, and those techniques tended to raise the level of distress in the room rather than being helpful. So now we know that debriefing is one possible option that might be helpful for people, but not something that everybody should be mandated to participate in. Some people, if you think about um, the stresses and coping strategies tool, some want to talk about it and find that helpful. Others need to spend time by themselves in order to reconstitute and rebalance.
And maybe real briefly, Patricia, as we wrap up, I think in particular for detention and residential staff, especially line level staff, but even the staff that maybe are working in other supportive roles within buildings,
Mhm.
we know that the nature of the juvenile population has changed. And do you have any thoughts on primary exposures that can occur when staff witness youth physically assaulting one another or serious injuries? And do you have any thoughts on that of how we should be thinking about then secondary traumatic stress when in fact we can actually be experiencing what you call this primary exposure when staff are working in these settings?
That's such a good point. I had a slide on it that, for the sake of time, I decided that that's a big topic. But yes, in the listening sessions that I have done, I have heard a mix of things that are secondary and primary exposures, as well as particular experiences that themselves, the two are intertwined. And I think we don't know enough about the differences in exposure to primary or secondary trauma, but certainly from people who work in facilities, that is a significant concern. I think what I like about the secondary traumatic stress concept is it gets the attention of leaders when they hear You are asking staff to do things that we know can result in PTSD. Because it's secondary exposure, doesn't matter. It's still trauma.
Yeah, yeah, and really helpful, Patricia. And thank you so much, Patricia, for this wealth of information. I'm seeing lots of grateful comments being posted in the chat. And if you have, please note that the recording will be posted on the CTRJJ YouTube. If you registered for the webinar, you will get a follow-up email when that recording has been posted. But in case you'd like to download that certificate that I mentioned at the very beginning of the webinar, please grab your phones and you can take a quick snapshot. This provides the web link. It is a password protected access point. And so you'll be queued and you could enter the password facility to obtain a copy of the certificate listed on this slide.